I am a black American, but many of us aren't seen as patriotic unless we drape ourselves in the symbolism of America. So I decided to display this bandana replica of the American flag to show my patriotism. Of course, this flag is a symbol of America that, along with the national anthem, finds itself lately in the middle of a shitstorm of controversy. Americans' allegiance to our symbols comes from our allegiance to associations in general. Here, the association is our group of diverse American citizens, and our allegiance to each other, our cohesion despite our diversity, is the cornerstone of our strength as a nation. Yet it is important to realize that this cohesion isn't and never has been akin to a melting pot's production of an alloy of common thought nor processes. We're more like the patched quilt described repeatedly on the campaign trail of then presidential candidate Jesse Jackson. And our Constitution guarantees the individual right of each patch, if you will, to be its own individual self and yet be a part of the quilt, the fabric of America. These individual freedoms allow us the freedom of assembly, of peaceful protest, freedom both of religion and from religion, and even the freedom to desecrate, ignore, protest, and disregard even our most venerable symbols, including the flag and the national anthem, as extensions of our freedom of speech. There are indeed challenges to these freedoms, but we have learned to accept them as the thorns that accompany the sweet rose of freedom. For these freedoms are the very cornerstone of our democracy. You see, we in America have determined that our democracy goes farther than a simple right to vote for political representatives and then sit quietly while hoping our representatives actually do what is in the best interest of the country and not cater to their largest political constituencies only. Because once elected, our presidents, congressmen, and judges represent all of America. So, our democracy is constructed not only with the fail-safe that the three branches provide power checks upon each other, we, the citizens, also have the right to influence the direction of governance via peaceful political protest. This right of peaceful protest isn't given only to those of us who reflect the majority's feelings about particular issues. Fringe groups are also accorded this right simply because they are citizens. This means that the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazi groups, and even Confederate groups, whose very existence represent tacit support of mutiny against the government, all have the right of peaceful protest, assembly, and airing of their concerns simply because they are citizens. Even they have their patch on the quilt that is America. And though they are free at any time to construct their respective patch to closely resemble other patches, it's not mandatory. It's their prerogative, their choice. So despite the cry of many, including our Manchurian president, we as Americans don't have to love everything about our country or leave it. We actually get to stay, protest what we don't like, and still reap the benefits of being American. This is Americana at its best. Peaceful, demonstrative action by even citizen factions representing minority opinions are allowed to help shape the direction of our democracy. This obliterates the need for military coups, for changes in political direction, and allows for peaceful transitions of political power. The auspicious vision of our founding fathers is that despite a clear objective to allow only incremental change in our oligarchical plutocracy that is yet substantively democratic, their paradigm did allow for change. So why are you calling our democracy an oligarchical plutocracy, Howard? Well, because like virtually every other national government, it is. We spent a large part of the last century talking about getting money out of politics without acknowledging that America was founded as a nation ruled by the few who are rich, the rich who are few, an oligarchical plutocracy, or plutocratic oligarchy if you prefer. Now, I know that this is hard to acknowledge, but just as Maya Angelou poignantly stated in On the Pulse of Morning, a poem written specifically for Bill Clinton's 1993 presidential inauguration, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived and, if faced with courage, need not be lived again. It is a fact that only 6% of America's population voted in the election of our first president, and it wasn't because of voter apathy. Only 6% voted because only property owners were allowed to vote, and only 6% of the population owned the requisite amount of property, ruled by the few, the rich. These 6% voted for the people who staffed the inaugural government, who in turn created our laws, albeit following constitutional guidelines. But only property owners could sit on a jury, which means the same 6% who staffed a proxy government to enact laws favoring them, the 6%, the government's only political constituency, were the same 6% who determined whether or not a law was broken, ruled by the few who are rich, by the rich who are few, ruled by property owners through the government they constructed. Sound familiar? The government then was a tool of property owners, just as today government is a tool of big business. So 6 years ago, when Mitt Romney said during a campaign rally that Obama's policies would induce class warfare, he was very disingenuous. The upper crust Americans waged outright war on 94% of us for 80 years. It was simply a backward way of waging wars. I mean, in most wars, the violence is on the front end and the negotiations are on the back end. The war the upper crust wages against the 94% has always featured negotiations on the front end and violence on the back end to induce cooperation. After the Declaration of Independence declared that all men are created equal, it took another 80 years for our America to bestow voting rights to all white male non-property owners. But that's only the surface. It took 89 years after D.I. Day, or Declaration of Independence Day, for slavery to be abolished. 144 years for white women to gain the vote. 148 years for Native Americans to gain citizenship, but actually 186 years before they fully gained the vote. It took 188 years both to give my black brethren the vote and to eliminate poll taxes in federal elections. And it took 189 years before tax and property requirements were abolished in state elections. So my guess is that when the drafters of the document proclaimed that all men are created equal, they were referring to all white male property owners. Now this lines up neither with the halo our American history classes bestow upon our founding fathers, nor our notions of democracy, does it? But again, it's ruled by the few who are rich, and by the rich who are few. The few, the rich. And yet, the living and breathing label that our history classes dub our Constitution with is accurate. Our Constitution does allow for change, however incremental, and our right to protest is vitally important in the actualization of said change. The bottom line is that for America's quilt to be a comfort to us all, it is imperative that we understand that all of America's citizens don't experience her the same way. Also, And as a law school graduate, regardless of having never practiced, I can firmly attest to the truth of this matter. In America, we only have the rights we're willing to fight for, be it in the courtrooms or via protest in the streets. Now consider the plight of Native Americans. Their experience with America can be said to be akin to the Palestinian experience with Israel. Outsiders came in, were initially embraced by the natives, who proceeded to take their land and form their own country, where the original natives became second-class citizens to the new natives. Native American lands were invaded by the Brits 411 years ago. 169 years later, after seizing virtually all of their land, the invaders established a new government on their land. It took another 148 years for them to gain second-class citizenship without voting rights, and another 38 years for them to gain full citizenship complete with voting rights. That's a total of 355 years from the invasion of their land until America granted them full citizenship in the replacement government. Now, with this timeline as a guide, it would seem that Palestinians have miles to go before they sleep. On top of that, we still disrespect Native Americans daily with our insistence upon keeping sports mascots that are demeaning to them. Expecting them to venerate the symbolism of America is unrealistic. The only real expectation we can have of them is that they obey the laws in their protesting and court filings and seeking a more perfect union from their perspective. And make no mistake about it, there are many different perspectives in America as to just what will make our country a more perfect union. That's why true dialogue and not the hateful rhetoric espoused by Donald and Trump is preferable. And while we're on the president, let's discuss the black experience with America. The late great Langston Hughes wrote in a verse near the end of his 1938 poem entitled, "Let America Be America Again," these words: "Oh yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." Now, 80 years later, America is much closer to truly being America to black people, but not entirely. This is why we protest and feel the need to remind America that Black lives matter. Now, I personally have no issue with our flag, but I don't view Independence Day the same way white folk in America view it, and I do have serious issue with the national anthem. We'll talk about that later. American Independence Day for black folk in this country is symbolic of the fact that our white American masses wrestled their freedom from their British masses. Black folk were still enslaved for many years thereafter. And keep in mind the third stanza of the Star-Spangled Banner that I've already said I have an issue with, and here's the reason. Now, we all remember this part in the first stanza. "And the rocket's red glare." Well, in the third stanza, in that same cadence, the words are, "No refuge can save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight and the doom of the grave." A verse aimed at the fighters the British hired to fight against the colonizers, as well as the slaves that the British had promised freedom to, as the prize for fighting with a triumphant Britain. It goes a little bit like this. "No refuge can save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight and the doom of the grave, and the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the slave. Okay, I substituted the word slave for brave at the end, but actually it's a more appropriate word for the feel of the verse. Now, if any of you think that I would actually sing a song anthem or not, that threatens to hunt down and kill slaves who fight for their freedom, you got another thing coming. That shit ain't nothing for me to exalt. So I never stand for the anthem unless I turn my back. And when watching games from home, I either mute the TV while the anthem is playing or turn the channel until it's finished. Remember that whereas white folk in America got their freedom from their British masters by winning the Revolutionary War, my ancestors, at least those who fought for their freedom on the other side, would have obtained their freedom had the British won. And their bravery is desecrated by the national anthem. Additionally, the rest of my ancestors would have been freed some 30 years earlier with America under British rule, as the British abolished slavery that much sooner than we did in America. Thus, the 4th of July, aka Independence Day, becomes a bit bittersweet for woke black folk. Yep, we'll still celebrate a holiday, but it just doesn't mean the same to us. I'm just saying. Now, I don't want to belabor this point, but I do want to examine a few more groups of people who also undeniably experience America a bit differently. Mexican Americans, Americans originally from Central America, certain islanders, Confederate groups, Puerto Ricans, women, Japanese Americans, Muslims, all groups experience America differently than others. I will discuss the experience of some of these groups. Mexican Americans who are aware of history know that America basically took what is now Texas from Mexico, which started a war. That war ended with America having gained control of all the parts of present-day Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming by 1848. Almost 70 years later, after going to war to take her land, America made a deal with Mexico to hire temporary workers so that our manpower could be used abroad in another war, World War I. This was basically the start of a cycle of Mexicans working the land that was once theirs, being allowed to stay and build communities surrounding their work areas, and being ousted when the economy got bad. Sure, as Mexicans began to gain legal American citizenship, they also began the aiding and abetting of the illegal entry of fellow Mexicans, assisted with their housing, and helped them find illegal work, but they felt and probably still feel justified. Why? Because just like the Native Americans and Cuban Americans, their land was taken by a bully, us, Americans. Do you think that the Mexican American experience parallels the experience of most Americans? Cuban immigrants have about as long a history in America as Mexicans, because Spain once ruled over what is now Mexico, Florida, and the southwest quadrant of America, and what was the Louisiana Territory. Although America purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, Napoleon had only controlled the recaptured territory for 3 years. France had controlled the Louisiana Territory from 1699 to 1762. France ceded territory to Spain in 1762, near the end of the 7 Years' War. So, to recap, France ruled the Louisiana Territory for 63 years, followed by Spain's rule for 38 years, followed by the French occupation for another 3 years before being sold to America. So, like Mexican Americans, many Cuban Americans were always here, migrating during Spanish control of various sections of what now comprises the United States of America. Women experience America differently than men. After the declaration that all men are created equal, women endured another 144 years before America acknowledged that all men and women are created equal. Of course, that's equal in all respects except income. Income inequality has always been an issue for women in America since entering the labor force and continues to be to this very day. What I'm ultimately going to do here is to make the case that although an overwhelming majority of American citizens have been seriously treated poorly by America, a vast majority of us remain very patriotic and wouldn't dream of living anywhere else. In the end, you will understand why, and you will understand why protest is the only peaceful mechanism available to Americans to move the country closer to the more perfect union that has always been a reality for the elite, but a mere dream for the rest. Japanese Americans experience America in a very different way. Supposedly, the 1940 census established that there were 127,000 people of Japanese ancestry living in America that year. A year later, Japan attacked America, and we in turn, that is, put in concentration camps, about 120,000 of them. That's 95% of the Japanese living in America at the time. And 62% of them were Japanese Americans, i.e. U.S. citizens. It's widely held, at least according to Wikipedia, that the internment was born more of racism than any security risk they might pose. I don't know if that's true, but then again, America does have a long history of infection by the virus of racism. I mean, that's what started all this. Cops kill black people indiscriminately, black people protest, a racist president calls them SOBs. But the Japanese weren't the only foreign nationals interned during World War II. There were some German and Italian immigrants detained and interned as well, but in vastly lower numbers and percentage of their demographic. About 18,000 German nationalists were interned out of 1.2 million German immigrants in America at the time. And again, according to Wikipedia, there were 1,881 Italian nationals interned out of 695,000 in America. Then, not now. Also, unlike the Japanese internment, apparently there were no American citizens among the Germans and Italians interned. But before you adopt the Wikipedia stance that Japanese internment was racially motivated and the only reason American officials were more lenient on Germans and Italians in America was because they're white, remember this. Although Germany and Italy were the members of the opposition, just like Japan, it was Japan that attacked us. On top of the internment of the Japanese in America, we killed a number of their relatives when we dropped atomic bombs, knowing that doing so would result in thousands of civilian deaths. And the very worst part about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that President Truman knew that the Japanese were going to surrender. But Truman felt that using his new devastating weapon would put the world on notice. Don't fuck with America. Clearly, Japanese Americans would be justified in having a beef with America, but most of them are very patriotic as well.